The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as Professor Kethvar's 6 eyes scanned the diverse collection of students seated before him. Representatives from 12 different species filled the tiered seating of the Galactic Academy's Advanced Xenobiology classroom. Tall, graceful Altheans with their crystalline skin caught the artificial sunlight streaming through the massive viewport. Hulking Gorvani students sat in reinforced chairs, their rocky hide gleaming under the soft illumination. Delicate whisper moths floated near the ceiling, their gossamer wings barely visible as they communicated through pheromone clouds. And then there was Maya Chen, sitting in the 3rd row with a battered notebook and a cheap stylus, looking completely ordinary among the exotic assembly. The human exchange student had arrived at the academy 3 months ago, part of humanity's first attempt at interstellar education. Most faculty members had been skeptical about accepting a representative from the newly discovered species. Humans came from what the Galactic Survey had classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, a rating so extreme that most civilized species couldn't even survive in its atmosphere without extensive life support systems. But Maya appeared harmless enough. She was small by galactic standards, barely reaching the shoulder height of most species present. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothing was the standard academy uniform, though she'd modified it slightly to accommodate her species' unusual temperature tolerance. While other students wore multiple layers and environmental suits, she seemed comfortable in just the basic fabric. Professor Kethvar cleared his throat, a sound that resonated through multiple vocal chambers. Today we'll be examining the defensive mechanisms of various predatory life forms. As advanced students, you'll be handling live specimens to observe their threat responses in controlled conditions. A ripple of excitement passed through the classroom. Live specimen work was considered the pinnacle of xenobiology education, reserved only for senior students who'd proven their competence in theoretical studies. Before we begin, the professor continued, activating a holographic display that showed a secured laboratory chamber. I must remind you all of the safety protocols. These creatures, while contained, are still dangerous. The Vorthak spine runner we'll be studying today is a relatively docile predator from Kepler 442b, but it possesses neurotoxic quills and lightning-fast reflexes. The hologram zoomed in on a lizard-like creature about the size of a large dog. Its back was covered in iridescent spines that shifted color as they watched, and its elongated limbs ended in razor-sharp claws. Even through the containment field, students could see its muscles coiled with barely restrained energy. The specimen is secured in a Class 5 containment field, Professor Kethvar explained, gesturing toward the sealed chamber visible through the laboratory's transparent aluminum walls. Standard procedure requires that only I handle the creature directly, while you observe from behind the safety barrier. Zephyr, an Althean student known for his academic excellence, raised one of his 4 arms. Professor, what about the human? Shouldn't she be excused from this exercise? Her species lacks the natural defenses that the rest of us possess. Several students turned to look at Maya, their expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. The human simply raised an eyebrow and continued taking notes. An excellent question, Zephyr, the professor replied. However, student Chen has passed all the prerequisite safety examinations and has demonstrated adequate theoretical knowledge. Unless she chooses to excuse herself, she's welcome to participate in the observation. Maya looked up from her notes. I'd like to participate, Professor. This is exactly the kind of experience I came here for. Professor Kethvar nodded approvingly. Very well. Class, please follow me to the observation chamber. The students filed into the adjacent laboratory, where a thick barrier of reinforced transparent aluminum separated them from the containment area. The professor moved to a control console, his fingers dancing over holographic interfaces as he initiated the specimen release protocol. Observe carefully, he instructed. I'm going to lower the containment field gradually. allowing the Vorthak to emerge while maintaining environmental controls. The shimmer of the containment field began to fade, and the spine runner's head lifted, sensing the change in its environment. Its spines shifted from blue to deep purple, a clear sign of alertness. Professor Kethvar held up a sonic pacifier, a device designed to keep aggressive specimens calm during educational demonstrations. "Notice how the color change indicates heightened awareness," he explained, keeping his voice low. "The Vorthak is evaluating potential threats and escape routes. Its neurotoxic spines are now fully extended, ready to fire at any perceived danger." The creature took a cautious step forward, its eyes scanning the laboratory. Professor Kethvar began to explain the typical hunting patterns of Kepler 442b predators when something went wrong. The sonic pacifier flickered and died. The change in the Vorthak was immediate and terrifying. Its spines shifted to brilliant red, and a low, growling sound emerged from its throat. Professor Kethvar stepped back, reaching for the emergency containment controls, but the creature was faster than anyone had anticipated. It launched itself directly at him. The professor stumbled backward, dropping the broken pacifier as the Vorthak's claws raked across his protective vest. The emergency containment field tried to reactivate, but the creature was already beyond the perimeter. Several students screamed as the predator landed heavily on the laboratory floor, its toxic spines now aimed directly at the class. "Nobody move!" Professor Kethvar shouted, blood seeping through his torn vest. "Vorthak respond to motion. If you stay perfectly still, it might—" His words were cut off as the creature's attention fixed on something behind the observation barrier. Through the transparent aluminum, it had spotted the clustering students, and its primitive brain interpreted their huddled forms as either prey or a threat. The Vorthak reared back, preparing to fire a volley of neurotoxic spines directly at the observation window. That was when Drakmor made the worst possible decision. The young Gorvani student had always prided himself on his species' warrior heritage. His rocky hide had turned an anxious gray color as the situation deteriorated, and when he saw the predator preparing to attack his classmates, something primal took over. Grabbing a dissection knife from the nearby equipment table, he raised it above his head and let out a traditional Gorvani war cry. "For the honor of stone and steel!" The blade gleamed under the laboratory lights as he brought it down in a dramatic arc, clearly intending to shatter the observation barrier and confront the creature directly. It was exactly the kind of heroic gesture that Gorvani legends celebrated, and exactly the wrong response to a triggered predator. The Vorthak's spines snapped to full extension, its targeting reflexes locking onto the largest moving threat. Professor Kethvar dove for the emergency controls, but everyone could see he wouldn't reach them in time. The creature drew back, its spine launcher muscles coiling with deadly force. And then Maya Chen laughed. Not a nervous giggle or a hysteria-induced cackle, but a genuine, amused chuckle that somehow carried clearly through the chaos. Every eye in the laboratory turned to her as she stepped forward, moving with casual confidence toward the barrier where Drakmor stood frozen with his raised knife. "Seriously?" she said, her voice carrying a tone of fond exasperation. "Drak, put the knife down before you hurt yourself. You're making yourself a target." The absurdity of the situation seemed to dawn on everyone simultaneously. Here was the smallest, most fragile-looking being in the room, calmly critiquing the combat technique of a species literally made of living rock, while a deadly predator prepared to spray them all with neurotoxins. Maya reached up and gently took the knife from Drakmor's suddenly nerveless fingers. "There we go," she said, setting it aside. "Now let's deal with our friend here." She turned toward the Vorthak, which was now thoroughly confused by this development. Its spines wavered between red and purple as it tried to assess whether this new small creature represented a threat or not. "Hey there, beautiful," Maya said, her voice taking on the same tone she might use with a nervous cat. "You're scared, aren't you? Big, strange place, weird smells, loud noises. I get it." Professor Kethvar, still reaching for the emergency controls, called out urgently. "Student Chen, please step back. The creature is in full defense mode. It will attack anything that moves." Maya glanced back at him with what could only be described as a patient smile. "Professor, with respect, I think there might be some things about predator behavior that weren't covered in your textbooks." She turned back to the Vorthak and began walking toward the barrier. Not creeping or sneaking, but moving with the steady, unhurried pace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. The creature's spines tracked her movement, but something in her posture seemed to confuse its threat assessment protocols. "The thing about cornered predators," Maya continued, speaking as much to the class as to the creature, "is that they're not actually trying to hunt. They're trying to survive. Everything looks like a threat when you're scared and confused." She reached the transparent aluminum barrier and placed her palm against it, directly in front of the agitated predator. The Vorthak stared at her through the transparent material, its spines now cycling rapidly through different colors as its primitive brain tried to process what it was seeing. "Look at those color changes," Maya observed, as if she were commenting on the weather. "That's not aggression anymore, that's confusion. It doesn't know what to make of me because I'm not acting like prey or predator." The creature took a tentative step closer to the barrier, its head tilted at an almost curious angle. Professor Kethvar had managed to reach the emergency controls, but found himself hesitating, uncertain whether activating them might escalate the situation. "Student Chen," he called softly, "what are you doing?" "Teaching," Maya replied simply. "Though I think our friend here is teaching us too." The Vorthak was now directly against the barrier, separated from Maya's hand by only the thickness of the transparent aluminum. Its spines had settled into a steady blue-green color that none of the students recognized from their textbooks. "Professor," Maya said, "I think your sonic pacifier was actually stressing it out. The frequency was probably similar to the distress calls of its natural prey. You were essentially torturing it." A moment of profound silence filled the laboratory as the implications of her words sank in. Professor Kethvar's multiple eyes widened as he considered the possibility that their supposedly humane containment methods were anything but. "But the research clearly states," he began. "The research was conducted in laboratory settings by beings who never had to live alongside creatures like this," Maya interrupted gently. "Sometimes the best way to understand a predator is to think like prey that survived." The Vorthak had settled into an almost relaxed posture, its attention focused entirely on the human girl on the other side of the barrier. Its spines continued their blue-green display, and now it was making soft chirping sounds that definitely weren't in the textbook descriptions. "It's trying to communicate," Zephyr observed, his crystalline skin flickering with academic excitement. "Those vocalizations aren't listed in any of the behavioral studies." "Because nobody ever bothered to listen," Maya said. "They were too busy treating it like a monster instead of a confused animal far from home." She began making soft clicking sounds with her tongue, and the Vorthak's ears pricked forward with obvious interest. Within moments, it was responding with its own gentle vocalizations, creating what could only be described as a conversation between species. The entire class watched in amazement as the supposedly deadly predator settled down completely, its spines now displaying a warm amber color that radiated contentment. It even rolled onto its side slightly, exposing its more vulnerable belly in what any xenobiologist would recognize as a trust display. "Remarkable," Professor Kethvar breathed. "In 30 years of studying predator species, I've never seen anything like this." Maya smiled and gave the creature one final pat against the barrier before stepping back. Where I come from, Professor, this is just Tuesday. We share our world with much scarier things than this little guy. The Vorthak made a soft, whining sound as she moved away, clearly disappointed to lose its new friend. Maya turned to face the class, and for the first time, several students noticed that her smile had a sharp edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Now then," she said, picking up her notebook and stylus, "shall we continue with the lesson? I believe you were going to explain the creature's defensive mechanisms. But I think we've learned that the most effective defense isn't always the most obvious one." Professor Kethvar slowly reactivated the containment field, noting that the Vorthak didn't resist or show any signs of distress. If anything, it seemed calmer now than it had been when the demonstration began. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. "Yes, I believe we have indeed learned something unexpected today." As the class took their seats again, whispered conversations broke out in a dozen different languages and communication methods. Drakmore slumped into his chair, his rocky hide now a deep embarrassed brown, while other students looked at Maya with expressions ranging from awe to barely concealed fear. The small human girl simply opened her notebook to a fresh page and waited for the professor to resume his lecture, as if calming deadly predators was exactly as routine as she'd claimed. But several of the more observant students noticed that her earlier notes contained detailed behavioral observations about the Vorthak that went far beyond anything covered in their textbooks, written in handwriting that suggested she'd been taking them for weeks before this demonstration ever took place. Maya Chen, it seemed, had been preparing for this moment, and that raised some very interesting questions about exactly what kind of education she'd received on her Deathworld home. Word of the incident spread through the Galactic Academy faster than light-speed communications. By the next morning, Maya Chen found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from both faculty and students. The official report described her actions as unconventional but effective, while the unofficial gossip ranged from respectful admiration to nervous speculation about what other surprises the human might be hiding. Maya herself seemed completely unaware of the attention she'd generated. She attended her morning comparative government lecture with the same quiet focus she'd shown since arriving at the academy, took careful notes during advanced mathematics, and even participated in a study group for galactic history without any mention of the previous day's events. It wasn't until Professor Veltar's theoretical combat strategies class that things became interesting again. The course was considered one of the most challenging in the Academy's curriculum, designed to teach future diplomats and military officers how to analyze conflicts between species with vastly different capabilities. Professor Veltar, a whisper moth whose gossamer wings had been replaced with mechanical prosthetics after a combat injury, was known for his unorthodox teaching methods and his insistence that true strategic thinking required understanding your opponent's psychology as much as their weapons. "Today," Professor Veltar announced, his artificial wings casting strange shadows as they caught the light, "we will be conducting our first practical simulation of the semester. Each of you will be assigned a species profile and tasked with developing a defensive strategy against a hypothetical invasion force." The classroom buzzed with excitement. Practical simulations were the closest most students would ever come to real military planning, and they provided valuable insights into the complex realities of interspecies conflict. "The scenario is this," Professor Veltar continued, activating a massive holographic display that filled the center of the room. "Your homeworld has been targeted by the Corvin hegemony, an aggressive expansionist faction known for their overwhelming numerical superiority and their willingness to accept massive casualties to achieve their objectives." The hologram showed a typical Corvin assault fleet, bristling with weapons and troop transports. The sight sent an uncomfortable ripple through the classroom as several students came from systems that had actually faced Corvin aggression in recent decades. Your defensive forces are limited to standard planetary militias and whatever natural advantages your assigned world might possess. No fleet support, no allied reinforcements, just what any typical colony world might reasonably expect to have available. Professor Veltar began distributing data tablets to each student, each one containing detailed information about their assigned world and its inhabitants. You have 2 hours to develop a comprehensive defense plan. Then we'll present each strategy to the class for analysis and critique. Maya glanced down at her assignment and felt a familiar spark of interest. Her tablet displayed extensive information about Kepler 186f, a lush garden world populated by the peaceful harmony singers, a telepathic species whose greatest military achievement was the development of non-lethal crowd control techniques. Their homeworld was known for its beautiful crystal forests and its complete absence of predatory life forms. Around her, other students were already deep in their assignments. Zephyr was analyzing the defensive potential of Althean crystal manipulation abilities, while Drakmor studied the siege capabilities of mountain-dwelling Gorvani fortress cities. The Whisper Moth students had clustered together, communicating through rapid pheromone exchanges as they tackled the defense of aerial cities. Maya, however, spent her first hour doing something that surprised the few students who noticed. She was researching the Corvin themselves. While others focused on maximizing their assigned species' natural advantages, Maya dove deep into Corvin military doctrine, historical tactics, and psychological profiles. She cross-referenced their invasion patterns with environmental factors, analyzed their supply line requirements, and even studied the cultural significance of their most common battle formations. "Interesting approach, Miss Chen," Professor Veltar observed, drifting over to her workstation on nearly silent artificial wings. "Most students focus on their own capabilities first." "I figured I should understand what I'm fighting before I decide how to fight it," Maya replied, not looking up from her research. "The Corvin are fascinating. They're actually not as aggressive as everyone thinks they are." Professor Veltar's compound eyes glittered with interest. "How do you mean?" "Well, look at this," Maya said, highlighting several data points on her screen. "Their invasion patterns always follow the same basic template. They show up with overwhelming force, demand immediate surrender, and then offer surprisingly generous terms if the defenders comply quickly. It's only when they meet prolonged resistance that they become truly brutal." She pulled up historical records of several Corvin invasions, showing the stark difference in casualty rates between worlds that surrendered within the first 72 hours and those that attempted extended campaigns. "They're not sadists," Maya continued. "They're impatient. Every day of fighting costs them resources they'd rather spend on the next target." The reputation for brutality is actually a psychological weapon designed to avoid having to fight in the first place. Professor Veltar settled onto a nearby perch, his attention fully focused on his human student. "And how does this insight inform your defense strategy?" Maya smiled, and there was something in that expression that made the professor suddenly remember that humans came from a world classified as nearly uninhabitable by galactic standards. "It doesn't," she said cheerfully, "because I'm not planning to fight them." The next hour passed quickly as Maya finalized her strategy. Around her, other students put the finishing touches on elaborate defense plans involving everything from orbital bombardments to guerrilla warfare in crystal caverns. When Professor Veltar called for presentations to begin, the energy in the room was electric with anticipation. Zephyr went first, presenting a sophisticated plan that used Althean crystal-shaping abilities to create massive orbital mirrors capable of focusing their star's energy into defensive laser arrays. His strategy was elegant and technically impressive, earning nods of approval from both professor and classmates. Drakmore followed with a presentation on fortress warfare that turned mountain cities into virtually impregnable strongholds, complete with underground supply networks and strategic choke points. His plan was methodical and thorough, showing exactly the kind of tactical thinking the Gorvani were famous for. Several other students presented equally impressive strategies, each one showcasing their assigned species' particular strengths while addressing the Corvan threat with varying degrees of success. Then it was Maya's turn. She stood up and activated the holographic display, but instead of showing defensive fortifications or weapon deployments, her presentation began with what appeared to be a cultural overview of Kepler 186f. The Harmony Singers, she began, are known throughout the galaxy for three things: their telepathic abilities, their musical culture, and their complete pacifism. They've never fought a war, never developed military technology, and consider violence to be literally incomprehensible. Several students shifted uncomfortably. Everyone could see the obvious problem with this assignment. How could a completely peaceful species possibly defend itself against the Corvan? Now, the traditional approach would be to find some way to weaponize their telepathy or use their musical abilities as a form of sonic warfare, Maya continued. But that would require the Harmony Singers to become something they're not. It would destroy their culture in order to save it. She advanced to the next slide, which showed a detailed timeline of the first 72 hours of a typical Corvan invasion. Instead, I studied what the Corvan actually want. They're not interested in enslaving populations or stripping worlds bare. They're building an empire, and empires need productive, stable populations. The brutality only comes when they meet resistance that threatens their timeline and resource allocation. The hologram shifted to show Kepler 186f's orbital approaches, but instead of defensive positions, Maya had marked them with what appeared to be concert venues. "So my strategy is this," she said, her voice taking on an almost casual tone. "When the Corvan fleet arrives and demands surrender, the Harmony Singers immediately agree, not just agree, but enthusiastically welcome them as honored guests." The classroom erupted in confused murmurs. Professor Veltar raised one wing for silence, his own expression unreadable. "The moment the Corvan ships enter orbit," Maya continued, "every Harmony Singer on the planet begins singing. Not a weapon, not a battle cry, but the most beautiful, complex, telepathically enhanced musical composition ever created. Something so magnificent that it stops the invasion force in their tracks." She activated the next phase of her presentation, showing cultural exchange protocols and diplomatic frameworks. The Harmony Singers invite the Corvan to experience their music, to understand their art, to participate in their culture. And here's the key. They make it clear that this incredible gift, this galaxy-renowned artistic achievement, can only exist in a state of perfect peace. Any violence, any militarization would literally destroy the thing the Corvan have just discovered. Maya looked around the classroom, noting the mix of confusion and fascination on her classmates' faces. Within a week, the Corvan fleet commanders are sending messages back to their superiors requesting permission to establish Kepler 186f as a cultural preserve rather than a military conquest. Within a month, the Harmony Singers have invitations to perform throughout the Corvan Empire. Within a year, they've become so culturally significant that attacking their world would be like burning down the galaxy's greatest art museum. She deactivated the hologram and returned to her seat. Total casualties, 0. Resources expended, minimal. Time required, significantly less than a prolonged siege. And the Harmony Singers never had to compromise their values or become something they weren't. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Professor Veltar stared at Maya for a long moment, his compound eyes unblinking. "Miss Chen," he said finally, "what you've described isn't a military strategy at all." "No, sir, it isn't," Maya agreed. It's a complete cultural conversion of an enemy force through strategic manipulation of their priorities and self-interest. Yes, sir. That's exactly what it is. Professor Veltar's artificial wings began to vibrate with what students had learned to recognize as deep thought. And where precisely did a student from a recently contacted Deathworld learn to think in such terms? Maya's smile returned, and several students later claimed they felt a chill run down their spines when they saw it. Where I come from, Professor, we've had a lot of practice dealing with overwhelming force. We've learned that the best way to win a fight is usually to avoid having the fight in the first place. She paused, apparently considering her next words carefully. Of course, that only works when your opponent is rational enough to be manipulated. When they're not, she shrugged. Well, that's when you have to get creative. The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Several students found themselves wondering exactly what methods humans employed when cultural manipulation wasn't an option, and none of them were entirely sure they wanted to know the answer. Professor Veltar assigned grades in silence, but when he reached Maya's presentation, he paused for a long moment before marking something on his tablet that made his wings flutter with what looked like either admiration or concern. As the class ended and students began filing out, Maya gathered her things with the same unhurried efficiency she'd shown since arriving at the academy. She seemed completely unaware that half her classmates were now watching her with expressions ranging from newfound respect to barely concealed nervousness. But Drakmor, whose pride was still stinging from the previous day's knife incident, couldn't quite let it go. It's easy to talk about avoiding fights when you're too small to win them anyway, he muttered, loud enough for the nearby students to hear. Maya paused in packing her bag and looked up at the towering Gorvani student. For just a moment, her expression was completely unreadable. You know, Drak, she said conversationally, you're absolutely right. I am too small to win a fair fight with you. That's why I'd never be stupid enough to try to fight you fairly. The casual way she said it, as if discussing the weather, somehow made the statement far more unsettling than any direct threat could have been. Drakmor's rocky hide shifted to an uncertain gray color as he tried to process whether he'd just been insulted, threatened, or simply educated. Maya finished packing her bag and headed for the door, pausing just long enough to add, "See you all in advanced xenobiology tomorrow. Professor Kethvar promised we'd be working with something called a razor-claw stalker. Should be fun." She left the classroom with her usual quiet confidence, leaving behind a group of students who were beginning to realize that Maya Chen might be far more dangerous than any of them had initially suspected. And the most unsettling part wasn't what she'd said or done. It was how completely normal she made it all seem, as if casually manipulating galactic empires and implying violence were just another part of her everyday educational experience, which, given that she came from a Class 12 Deathworld, might very well be exactly the case. The Razorclaw Stalker demonstration was scheduled for the following week, giving the Academy's Xenobiology department time to implement new safety protocols in light of the previous incident. Professor Kethvar had spent considerable time reviewing Maya's behavioral observations about the Vorthak, and his subsequent research had revolutionized several long-held assumptions about predator psychology. But the real changes weren't happening in the laboratory. They were happening in the dormitories, the dining halls, and the social spaces where students gathered to process what they'd witnessed. Maya Chen had become the subject of intense speculation and discussion among her classmates. The initial curiosity about the human exchange student had evolved into something approaching scientific fascination. Students from a dozen different species found themselves analyzing her every interaction, looking for clues about the true nature of Deathworld inhabitants. The consensus seemed to be that humans were far more complex and potentially dangerous than anyone had initially realized. "I've been reviewing the cultural databases," Zephyr confided to a small group of students gathered in the Academy's crystalline garden complex. His translucent skin flickered with patterns of deep concern as he spoke. The initial contact reports described humans as primitive but peaceful, but that assessment was based on limited observation. Ythara, a graceful whisper moth whose gossamer wings caught the artificial sunlight, released a pheromone cloud that translated roughly to skeptical agreement. The more we learn about their homeworld, the less sense their behavior makes. How does a species develop such sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques while supposedly isolated on a single planet? Maybe, Drakmore rumbled, his rocky hide still an embarrassed brown whenever the conversation turned to his knife incident. We're looking at this wrong. Maybe they didn't develop these skills in isolation. Maybe they developed them because they had to. The group fell silent as they contemplated the implications. Earth's classification as a Class 12 Deathworld meant it was considered barely habitable by galactic standards. The idea that humans had not only survived but thrived in such an environment suggested capabilities that the initial contact teams had completely missed. There's something else, Zephyr added quietly. I've been researching human military history in the galactic databases. The information is limited, but what's available is disturbing. He activated a small holographic display showing excerpts from Earth's historical records. Images of ancient battlefields, medieval warfare, industrial-scale conflicts, and weapons of mass destruction flickered through the projection. They've been fighting each other continuously for their entire recorded history, Zephyr continued. Not occasional territorial disputes or resource conflicts like most species, but constant escalating warfare using increasingly sophisticated methods. Ythara's wings shivered with distress. But that's impossible. No species could survive that level of internal conflict. It would lead to extinction within a few generations. Unless, Drakmore said slowly, they got so good at fighting that they could afford to keep doing it. The idea hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Most galactic civilizations had evolved past large-scale warfare millennia ago, typically after one or two conflicts that demonstrated its ultimate futility. The notion of a species that had fought continuously for thousands of years and not only survived but developed advanced technology was almost incomprehensible. She knew exactly how to manipulate the Corvan invasion scenario, Zephyr observed. Not because she studied them in our databases, but because humans understand warfare at a level that most of us can't even imagine. And she knew how to handle the Vorthak, added another student, because she understands predator psychology from personal experience. The implications were sobering. Maya Chen wasn't unusual among her species. She was typical. The entire human race had been forged in an environment that would kill most galactic citizens within hours, shaped by evolutionary pressures that produced beings capable of thinking strategically about violence while maintaining the psychological flexibility to choose alternative approaches when appropriate, which made her presence at the Academy either a tremendous opportunity for cross-cultural learning or a potentially catastrophic security risk. Meanwhile, Maya herself remained blissfully unaware of the intense scrutiny she was generating. She continued her studies with quiet enthusiasm, attended social gatherings with friendly interest, and maintained her reputation as one of the most helpful and approachable students in her year. It wasn't until the night before the Razorclaw Stalker demonstration that things came to a head. Maya was in the Academy's library, researching her upcoming cultural anthropology paper, when she noticed she was no longer alone. Drakmore, Zephyr, Ythara, and several other students had gradually assembled around her study table, creating what could charitably be called an informal intervention. Maya, Zephyr began carefully, we need to talk. She looked up from her research with genuine curiosity. Sure, what's up? Are you all having trouble with the anthropology assignment? I know the source material is pretty dense. It's not about the assignment, Drakmore said, his hide shifting to a nervous gray. It's about you. Maya blinked in apparent confusion. Me? What about me? We know you're not what you appear to be, Yathara stated, her pheromone release carrying overtones of diplomatic formality. The question is what your real purpose is here. For a moment, Maya simply stared at them. Then she began to laugh. Not the nervous giggle from the laboratory incident, but genuine delighted laughter that attracted attention from students throughout the library. "Oh," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "You think I'm some kind of spy or infiltrator, don't you?" The assembled students exchanged glances. That was exactly what several of them had been thinking. "Maya," Zephyr said seriously, "you handled a Class 5 predator with casual confidence, manipulated a military simulation using techniques that most species never develop, and demonstrated knowledge of psychological warfare that suggests extensive training in conflict resolution. Plus," Drakmore added, "you implied that you could easily defeat me in combat despite being a fraction of my size and mass. That's not normal diplomatic behavior." Maya's laughter subsided into an amused smile. "You're right, of course. I'm not normal. But not in the way you think." She gestured for them to sit down, and after a moment's hesitation, they did. "The thing is," Maya began, "you're all thinking about this backwards. You're trying to figure out what makes me special, when the real question is what makes you all so sheltered." She activated her data tablet and pulled up a series of files that made several students gasp with recognition. "I spent my first month here reading every piece of available information about galactic civilization, and you know what I discovered? Most of you have never experienced real danger in your entire lives." The files she was displaying showed environmental hazards from various homeworlds, atmospheric toxins that required protective gear, predators that were carefully managed through conservation protocols, natural disasters that were predicted and prevented through advanced technology. "Zephyr, your homeworld eliminated all dangerous predators 3,000 years ago. Yathara, your species evolved in an environment with such gentle atmospheric conditions that you literally cannot survive in unfiltered air from most other worlds. Drakmore, even though your people have a warrior tradition, you haven't fought a real war in over 2 millennia. She paused, looking around the group with an expression that was equal parts sympathetic and incredulous. "You've all grown up in a galaxy where safety is the default assumption, where dangerous situations are rare exceptions that require specialized training and equipment to handle, where the most threatening thing most people encounter in their daily lives is an academic examination." "And humans?" Zephyr asked quietly. Maya's smile took on that familiar sharp edge. "Humans grow up on a world where everything is trying to kill us all the time. Our weather can destroy cities without warning. Our predators hunt in packs, using coordinated strategies. Our plant life includes species that can kill with a touch. Our microbial environment is so hostile that most galactic species would die from infection within hours of exposure." She pulled up Earth's environmental classification, and several students winced at the sheer length of the hazard list. "We don't think of ourselves as particularly tough or dangerous," Maya continued. "We think of ourselves as barely competent enough to survive. The reason I could handle the Vorthok is because I've been dealing with more dangerous animals since I was old enough to walk. The reason I understood the Corvin strategy is because humans have been using those same techniques against each other for thousands of years." "But that's exactly what makes you dangerous," Drakmore pointed out. "You have capabilities that most of us can't even comprehend." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "True. But here's what you're missing. So do all of you." She gestured toward Zephyr. "Your crystal manipulation abilities could probably level a city if you really wanted to. You just never think about it because your culture has spent millennia developing peaceful applications for your gifts." She turned to Yathara. "Your pheromone communication could easily be weaponized into chemical warfare. but your species uses it for art and diplomacy instead. Her gaze settled on Drakmore. And you're literally made of living rock. You could probably punch through a starship hull if you put your mind to it, but you're so focused on honor and protection that you'd never consider using your strength maliciously. The students exchanged glances, beginning to understand her point. The difference isn't that humans are more dangerous, Maya explained. The difference is that we've never had the luxury of forgetting how dangerous we could be. We've had to stay sharp because our environment never stopped testing us. So what happens now? Ythra asked. What happens when your species joins galactic civilization and discovers that most of the galaxy is softer than your homeworld? Maya's expression became thoughtful. I guess that depends on what kind of galaxy we're joining. If it's one where strength is used to protect rather than exploit, where different capabilities are valued rather than feared, where cooperation is chosen over conquest, then humans will probably fit in just fine. She paused, her smile returning. But if it's a galaxy where being dangerous automatically makes you the bad guy, where being capable of violence means you can't be trusted with peace, then you might have a problem. The implicit challenge was clear, and it hung in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. Tomorrow's demonstration should be interesting, Zephyr observed quietly. Yes, Maya agreed, gathering her research materials. Professor Kethvar mentioned that razor-claw stalkers are significantly more aggressive than Vorthak spine runners. Apparently, they're apex predators from a world where the competition for resources is so intense that they've evolved pack-hunting strategies and problem-solving intelligence comparable to most sentient species. She stood up, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Should make for a good learning experience, for all of us. As she walked away, the assembled students sat in contemplative silence. Maya Chen had just revealed that she represented not an anomaly, but a sample. Humanity as a whole possessed capabilities that could reshape the balance of power in galactic civilization. The question was whether that would prove to be a blessing or a catastrophe. The next morning, Professor Kethvar's advanced xenobiology class assembled with unusual tension. Word had spread about the previous evening's conversation, and students who hadn't been directly involved were now eyeing Maya with new wariness. The razor-claw stalker contained in the laboratory's reinforced chamber was indeed more impressive than the Vorthak had been. Nearly twice the size, with obvious intelligence gleaming in its multifaceted eyes and claws that could probably shred most known materials. Its pack-hunting adaptations were clearly visible in its communication organs and coordination mechanisms. Today's demonstration will be conducted under enhanced safety protocols, Professor Kethvar announced, his multiple eyes scanning the class with particular attention to Maya's section. The razor-claw stalker is considered a Class 7 predator, and under no circumstances will the containment barriers be compromised. Maya raised her hand. Professor, has anyone ever tried communicating with them? The intelligence indicators suggest they might be more sophisticated than standard predator classification assumes. Several students tensed, waiting to see if Maya was about to attempt another of her unconventional interactions. Professor Kethvar considered the question carefully. There have been some theoretical studies, but the aggressive nature of the species has made direct communication attempts too dangerous to justify. Of course, Maya said mildly. That makes sense. But as the demonstration progressed, and the razor-claw stalker displayed increasingly complex problem-solving behaviors, it became clear that Maya's question had been more than casual curiosity. The creature was studying them just as intently as they were studying it, and when it began manipulating the containment field controls with obvious deliberate intent, Maya Chen's expression suggested that she was about to teach her classmates yet another lesson they weren't prepared for. The age of human integration into galactic civilization had begun, and neither side was quite ready for what was coming next.